They found him at dawn, swaying from the oak beam in the tobacco barn. His boots were just inches from the ground, toes pointing downward like he'd been reaching for something that wasn't there. The rope was thick hemp, the kind they used for loading cotton bales onto riverboats. What made everyone fall silent wasn't just the sight of James Harwell's body, turning slowly in the morning breeze. It was the question nobody could answer. 3 days before he died, a field hand named Benjamin had asked him something. Just one question. And from that moment until they cut him down, James Harwell hadn't been the same man. The question itself seemed innocent enough. People who were there said Benjamin's voice had been quiet, almost respectful. But whatever those words were, they did something to Harwell that 20 years of overseeing enslaved people, surviving 2 plantation fires, and weathering the tensions leading up to the war, never managed to do. They broke him, and now, with his body laid out in the estate house while the county sheriff paced the grounds looking for answers, everyone who'd worked at Riverside Estate in Halifax County, Virginia, wanted to know what exactly had Benjamin asked him. Before we continue with the story of James Harwell and the question that seemed to kill him, I want you to do something for me. If you're drawn to mysteries that blur the line between historical fact and disturbing truth, subscribe to Circle of Fear 1. We're building a community of people who aren't afraid to explore the darkest corners of America's past. And while you're here, drop a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I love knowing where our audience is joining us from. Now, let's step back to where this all began. Riverside Estate sat on 300 acres of prime tobacco land along the Dan River about 12 miles south of what would later become South Boston. The year was 1859, and the plantation belonged to a man named Albert Graves, whose family had worked that soil since before the Revolutionary War. The estate wasn't the largest in Halifax County, but it was profitable enough to employ 47 enslaved people and keep 3 overseers busy year-round. James Harwell was the head overseer, a position he'd held for nearly 7 years. To understand what happened to James Harwell, to truly grasp how a single question could destroy a man, you need to understand the world he inhabited. Riverside Estate in 1859 existed in a strange temporal space caught between a past that seemed eternal and a future that threatened to tear everything apart. The rhythms of plantation life had remained largely unchanged for generations. The planting in spring, the endless cultivation through summer, the harvest in late August and September, the curing and preparation for sale. These cycles had repeated so many times they seemed almost natural, as if the land itself had ordained this particular arrangement of labor and profit. But beneath that appearance of permanence, everything was fracturing. In the North, abolitionist sentiment had grown from a fringe movement into a political force powerful enough to elect representatives and influence policy. The Underground Railroad escaped enslaved people toward freedom with increasing efficiency. John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry was just weeks away, though nobody at Riverside Estate knew that yet. The entire social and economic structure of the South balanced on a knife's edge, and everyone could feel the instability, even if they couldn't articulate exactly what was coming. James Harwell was 38 years old, though people said he looked older. He had the weathered skin of a man who spent his days in the fields, watching and directing labor from sun up to sundown. His face was angular, with deep-set eyes that seemed to take in everything without revealing much in return. He stood about 5'10" in tall, with the kind of lean build that comes from constant movement rather than heavy labor. His hands, though roughened by sun and weather, weren't the hands of someone who worked the fields himself. They were the hands of someone who pointed, gestured, held tools of measurement, and tools of enforcement. He wasn't known for excessive cruelty, not like some overseers who took pleasure in their authority, who seemed to relish the power their positions afforded them. People who'd worked under truly sadistic overseers recognized that Harwell was different. He didn't smile when he enforced discipline. He didn't seem to derive satisfaction from the suffering of others, But he wasn't soft either. He ran Riverside Estate with the cold efficiency expected of him, maintaining order through a system of punishments and privileges that kept the operation running smoothly. He was, by the standards of his profession and time, competent and reliable. Albert Graves had hired Harwell in 1852 after the previous head overseer had died of fever. Graves had interviewed several candidates, and he'd chosen Harwell specifically because of what he called the man's appropriate disposition. By this, Graves meant that Harwell seemed neither cruel enough to damage valuable property through excessive violence, nor soft enough to allow disorder or reduce productivity. Harwell understood the economic logic of plantation management. Enslaved people represented significant financial investment, and damaging that investment was bad business. But maintaining productivity and preventing resistance required consistent enforcement of rules and hierarchy. Harwell walked that line effectively. In his 7 years at Riverside Estate, Harwell had never caused a death through punishment, had never injured anyone so severely they couldn't return to work within a few days, and had never faced any serious challenges to his authority. By the metrics Albert Graves used to evaluate such things, James Harwell was an excellent overseer. The tobacco crops had been consistently profitable during his tenure. Incidents of theft or destruction of property had been minimal. There had been no escape attempts, no organized resistance, no whispers of rebellion. The plantation operated like a well-maintained machine, and Harwell was the mechanic who kept all the parts functioning. Harwell lived in a small house at the eastern edge of the estate, close enough to the slave quarters to respond to any disturbances, but far enough to maintain the separation his position required. The house was simple. Just 3 rooms, really. A main living area with a fireplace, a small bedroom, and a smaller storage room. The furniture was sparse and functional. A bed, a table with 2 chairs, a chest for clothes, shelves for books and papers. He kept the place clean and organized, everything in its designated spot, nothing frivolous or decorative. He'd never married, though some of the house servants whispered that he'd once been engaged to a woman in Richmond who'd broken things off when she learned he'd accepted the overseer position. She said she couldn't marry a man who lived that way, one of the older women recalled. Said it would burden her soul. Whether that story was true or not, James Harwell lived alone, ate most of his meals in silence, and spent his evenings reading agricultural journals by lamplight. Sometimes he would sit on the small porch of his house after dark, smoking a pipe and watching the distant lights from the slave quarters, but he never joined the other overseers for drinks or cards, the way some men in his position. The enslaved people at Riverside Estate existed in that terrible space between survival and suffering that defined their existence throughout the South. They worked the tobacco fields from first light until dusk, their hands stained brown from handling the leaves, their backs bent from the endless cycle of planting, topping, and harvesting. The work was demanding in ways that went beyond simple physical exertion. Tobacco was a crop that required constant attention, careful timing, and skill developed over years of experience. The growing season began in late winter when seeds were planted in specially prepared beds. Once the seedlings reached the right size, they were transplanted to the main fields. Backbreaking work that involved stooping thousands of times per day to set each plant in the ground. Through the spring and summer, the plants required constant maintenance, weeding, examining for insects, removing suckers that grew between the main stalk and the leaves. When the plants flowered, those flowers had to be topped off to direct the plant's energy into leaf production rather than reproduction. Harvest came in late August and continued through September. The leaves were picked in stages, starting with the lowest leaves and working upward as each section matured. The picked leaves were then carried to the tobacco barn for curing, hung from long poles in the massive wooden structure where air could circulate around them. The curing process took weeks and required careful monitoring. Leaves that dried too quickly became brittle and lost value. Leaves that retained too much moisture could rot or mildew. and experienced, I could tell by color and texture, when the tobacco had reached the perfect state for packing and sale. The tobacco barn, where Harwell would eventually be found, was the heart of the operation. A massive wooden structure that dominated the landscape near the center of the estate. It had been built in the 1790s and rebuilt twice after fires, each time larger and more substantial than before. The current version measured nearly 80 ft long and 40 feet wide, with a peaked roof that rose to almost 30 at its highest point. Inside, the space was crisscrossed with beams and poles for hanging tobacco, creating a complex three-dimensional lattice that filled the entire volume of the building. During curing season, when the barn was full of hanging tobacco, entering it was like walking into a cathedral dedicated to a strange agricultural deity. The leaves hung in dense curtains, blocking most of the light, creating narrow corridors between the rows. And the smell was overwhelming, sweet and earthy, and bitter all at once. A scent so powerful it seemed to have physical weight. Dust particles and tiny fragments of dried tobacco leaf floated in the shafts of light that penetrated the walls, creating an atmosphere that was almost dreamlike in its golden haze. Benjamin was 26 years old and had lived at Riverside Estate his entire life. His earliest memories were of the quarters, of his mother's voice singing while she worked, of the taste of corn mush that constituted most meals, of the feeling of exhaustion that seemed to be the natural state of existence. He'd worked in the field since he was 8 years old, starting with simple tasks like carrying water to the adult workers, gradually taking on more demanding labor as he grew. His mother, Ruth, worked in the main house as a cook, a position that afforded her slightly better conditions than field work. Indoor labor, proximity to more food, a certain minimal prestige within the enslaved community's internal hierarchy. She was a woman of about 45, tall and thin, with hands scarred from years of kitchen work and eyes that seemed to carry the accumulated weight of everything she'd witnessed and endured. She'd been born on a plantation in North Carolina and sold to Albert Graves's father when she was 17. She rarely spoke about those early years, but sometimes Benjamin would catch her staring into the distance with an expression of such profound sadness that it seemed like grief had become a permanent part of her features. Benjamin's father had died 10 years earlier in an accident involving a tobacco press, one of the large mechanical devices used to compress dried tobacco leaves into compact bales for shipping. Something had gone wrong with the mechanism. The press had come down unexpectedly, and Benjamin's father had been caught beneath it. He'd lived for 3 days after the accident, but the internal injuries were too severe. Benjamin had been 16 at the time, old enough to understand death, but young enough that losing his father felt like the entire world had collapsed. After his father's death, Benjamin had become quieter, more withdrawn. He did his work efficiently and without complaint, but he seemed to exist behind a kind of invisible barrier, observing everything around him with an intensity that some people found unsettling. He rarely smiled, rarely participated in the small moments of community and connection that made life in the quarters bearable. But he was never hostile or difficult. He simply watched, listened, and remembered. What made Benjamin truly different from many of the others at Riverside Estate was that he could read. This was remarkable and dangerous in equal measure. Virginia law explicitly prohibited teaching enslaved people to read or write with harsh penalties for anyone caught violating the statute. The reasoning behind these laws was transparent. Literacy was power. Access to information, ability to forge passes or communicate across distances. An enslaved person who could read was an enslaved person who had access to newspapers describing abolitionist movements, to documents containing their own sale prices and legal descriptions, to the written arguments for and against the system that held them in bondage. Benjamin's mother had learned to read years earlier, taught by a former mistress who'd held progressive views unusual for her time and place. That mistress had died when Ruth was still young, and Ruth had carefully hidden her literacy understanding instinctively that revealing it would bring nothing but trouble. But she'd taught her son, conducting lessons in secret when he was just a boy, using whatever materials they could obtain. Oh, old newspapers rescued from trash, pages torn from damaged books, letters scratched in dirt where no paper was available. Benjamin had proven an excellent student, absorbing not just the mechanics of reading, but developing a hunger for any written material he could access. Over the years, he'd read scraps of agricultural journals left lying around, fragments of correspondence, posted notices in town on the rare occasions when he traveled there with work crews. He developed a mental library of information that most enslaved people never encountered. Descriptions of other states, accounts of political debates, mentions of the growing tensions between North and South. But Benjamin kept this ability absolutely hidden, understanding that knowledge could be as dangerous as defiance in a place like Riverside Estate. He never spoke about what he read, never let on that he understood the written notices posted on the estate or the newspapers that occasionally made their way to the plantation. When overseers discussed written documents in his presence, he maintained the expression of incomprehension expected of him. He simply watched, listened, and remembered everything, building a mental map of the world beyond Riverside Estate that he shared with no one, except occasionally in whispered conversations with his mother. In the late summer of 1859, as the tobacco harvest reached its peak, the tension throughout Virginia had become impossible to ignore. The debate over slavery was tearing the country apart, with some northern states actively helping enslaved people escape through what was becoming known as the Underground Railroad. In the South, plantation owners grew increasingly paranoid about rebellion, about abolitionists, about their entire way of life crumbling beneath them. Albert Graves hosted dinner parties where men drank bourbon and spoke in heated voices about states' rights and Southern sovereignty. Their words drifting across the grounds to where people labored in quarters that smelled of woodsome smoke and exhaustion. These gatherings had become more frequent as the political situation deteriorated. Graves and his peers would sit on the broad porch of the main house, their voices rising and falling with the rhythms of argument and agreement, while house servants moved silently among them, refilling glasses and clearing plates. Benjamin's mother would return from serving at these dinners with fragments of conversation, bits of news from the wider world. "They're scared," she told Benjamin one evening. "All their talk about Southern pride and defending their way of life, underneath it all, they're terrified. They know something's coming, even if they won't admit it." She paused, stirring the small pot of beans that constituted their evening meal. Mr. Graves told his guests that he's instructing the overseers to be more vigilant. Said there are rumors of abolitionist agitators trying to stir up rebellion. This increased vigilance manifested in various ways. The overseers conducted more frequent inspections of the quarters, searching for anything that might indicate organized resistance, weapons, suspicious correspondence, materials that could be used to forge travel passes. They questioned people more aggressively about their movements, their conversations, their relationships with others on the plantation. The atmosphere became noticeably more oppressive, as if the entire estate was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. James Harwell felt that tension too. He'd been approached twice by Albert Graves about rumors of agitation among the enslaved workforce, whispers of escape attempts being planned, of meetings being held in secret. Graves demanded Harwell keep stricter watch, implement more frequent inspections, root out any hint of organized resistance. Harwell complied, increasing his presence in the quarters, questioning people about their movements, searching cabins for any sign of the rebellion his employer feared. But Harwell was also troubled by something he couldn't quite articulate, even to himself. The increased scrutiny, the heightened paranoia, the constant emphasis on prevention and control, all of it was starting to feel different than it had in previous years. Before, his role had seemed straightforward: maintain order, ensure productivity, prevent problems. It was management, logistics, the practical implementation of an economic system. But now, with tensions rising and the future so uncertain, his daily activities felt increasingly like preparation for war. He was no longer just managing a workforce. He was suppressing potential resistance to a system that might not survive much longer. These thoughts troubled Harwell in ways he didn't fully understand or acknowledge. He'd spent 7 years developing psychological mechanisms to perform his role without being consumed by questions of morality or justice. He focused on practical matters, crop yields, equipment maintenance, efficiency metrics. He avoided thinking about the broader implications of what he did or the system he served. But the intensifying political crisis was making that avoidance harder. Every time he read a newspaper or overheard conversations about secession and war, he felt a subtle unease that he immediately suppressed. It was during one of these intensified inspections on a humid Tuesday in late August that the incident with Marcus occurred. Marcus was a young man, barely 20, with the kind of quiet dignity that some people carry even in the most degrading circumstances. He'd been born at Riverside Estate, had worked the tobacco fields his entire life, and had never caused any problems or drawn any particular attention to himself. He was simply one of dozens of people whose labor made the plantation profitable, whose names appeared in ledgers as property valuations rather than as human identities. Someone, it was never clear who, had informed James Harwell that Marcus possessed a small carved wooden figure that might be a signal of some kind, perhaps a marker for those planning to escape. The object itself was simple, a bird in flight, no more than 3 in long, whittled from a piece of oak with considerable skill. The wings were spread, the head turned slightly to one side, the feathers suggested through careful carving rather than detailed representation. It was objectively a beautiful piece of work, the kind of object someone creates during quiet moments as an expression of creativity or hope, or simply to have something to hold that represents beauty in a world largely devoid of it. But in the paranoid atmosphere of August 1859, a carved bird became something suspicious. Could it be a symbol, a signal, a violation of the unspoken rules about personal possessions and independent thought? James Harwell, under pressure from Albert Graves to demonstrate vigilance, made the decision to treat it as evidence of potential resistance. He confronted Marcus in the early evening after the day's work had concluded. Several other people were present, some returning from the fields, others preparing evening meals outside their cabins. Harwell held up the wooden bird and asked Marcus where he'd gotten it. Marcus explained honestly that he'd carved it himself over several weeks during the brief moments of free time available to him. He offered this information without defiance or evasion, simply stating a fact. Harwell asked what the bird signified. Marcus seemed confused by the question. "It's just a bird, sir," he said. "I like watching birds, how they fly. Wanted to make something like that. Nothing else," Harwell pressed. "Not a signal, not a symbol." "No, sir," Marcus answered. "Just a bird." Later, people would debate whether Harwell believed this explanation or not. Some thought he understood perfectly well that the carved bird was exactly what Marcus said it was, a simple piece of art created during scarce moments of personal time. Others believed Harwell had genuinely convinced himself there was something suspicious about it, caught up in the plantation's atmosphere of paranoia. A few suggested that Harwell knew the truth, but felt compelled to take action anyway, to demonstrate the vigilance Graves demanded, regardless of whether any actual threat existed. What everyone agreed on was what happened next. Harwell confiscated the carved bird and sentenced Marcus to punishment as an example. The punishment itself was never described in detail by those who witnessed it. This was partially due to the trauma of witnessing such things, but also because describing it explicitly would require acknowledging specifics that most people preferred to leave unspoken. What mattered was that it took place in view of others in the area between the quarters and the tobacco barn, and that it lasted until Marcus couldn't stand on his own. When it was over, 2 other men had to carry Marcus back to his cabin. His back was torn, his body trembling with shock and pain, his face blank with the kind of dissociation that occurs when suffering exceeds the mind's ability to process it. Ruth, Benjamin's mother, and several other women spent the night caring for him, applying what limited medical knowledge they had, trying to prevent infection and manage pain with no access to proper medicine or supplies. James Harwell walked away from the scene without expression, returned the carved bird to Albert Graves as evidence of his vigilance, and went about his remaining duties that day as if nothing significant had occurred. He made a brief entry in his journal. Disciplinary action, field hand Marcus unauthorized item, and that was the extent of the official record. No details about what the unauthorized item was, no description of the punishment, no note about Marcus's condition afterward, just a single line in a ledger, one entry among hundreds, easily overlooked if you weren't specifically searching for it. That evening, as the sun set over the tobacco fields and the day's work finally ended, Benjamin stood outside his mother's cabin and watched James Harwell cross the grounds toward his small house. The overseer walked with his usual measured pace, his hat pulled low against the insects that swarmed in the humid air. There was nothing in his posture or bearing to suggest that anything unusual had occurred. He looked exactly as he always looked, competent, distant, focused on whatever task came next. Benjamin stood there in the growing darkness, thinking about Marcus, about the carved bird, about all the violence that flowed through Riverside Estate, like the river that gave it its name. He thought about his father, killed in an industrial accident that had never resulted in any changes to safety procedures or equipment maintenance. He thought about his mother spending her life cooking meals for people who considered her property. He thought about himself hiding his ability to read because knowledge was treated as dangerous in a system built on keeping people ignorant of their own circumstances. And he thought about James Harwell, about how a man could perform such actions and then simply walk away, apparently unburdened by what he'd done. How did that work? But mental processes allowed someone to inflict suffering and then eat dinner, read agricultural journals, sleep through the night, and wake up the next morning ready to do it all again. Benjamin didn't have answers to these questions. But he was starting to formulate something, a recognition that men like Harwell maintained their psychological equilibrium through deliberate avoidance, through focusing on practical matters and official records, while ignoring everything that didn't fit into those frameworks. They looked at ledgers showing tobacco weights and equipment costs, not at faces and names and specific acts of violence. They counted bales and calculated profit margins, not consequences and suffering. The system worked because the people running it had developed ways to not see what they were actually doing. Over the next 2 days, life at Riverside Estate continued with its usual rhythms. The tobacco harvest progressed, the curing barn filled with hanging leaves, and James Harwell made his regular rounds of inspection and supervision. Marcus recovered slowly, returning to light work after 3 days, though he moved stiffly and winced when certain movements pulled at healing injuries. Nobody spoke directly about what had happened to him. Such conversations were dangerous, potentially interpreted as agitation or resistance, but the knowledge hung in the air like the tobacco dust that perpetually filled the barn. Benjamin continued his work, tending the tobacco plants and preparing harvested leaves for curing. He was assigned to spend Friday morning in the tobacco barn, checking the leaves on the lower racks and testing their dryness. It was solitary work, perfect for thinking, for turning over ideas that had been developing in his mind since the incident with Marcus. The barn was massive and quiet, filled with the overwhelming smell of curing tobacco. Light filtered through gaps in the wooden walls, creating columns of dusty illumination that cut through the darkness. Tobacco leaves hung from overhead racks in neat rows that stretched the entire length of the building. The atmosphere was almost meditative, the kind of space where thoughts could develop and crystallize without external interruption. Benjamin was checking the leaves on the lower racks, testing their texture between his fingers, when James Harwell entered the barn alone. Harwell often inspected the barn, so his presence wasn't unusual. He walked between the hanging tobacco, making notes in the small leather journal he always carried. Benjamin continued his work, aware of the overseer, but not acknowledging him directly. This was the expected behavior. Maintain focus, show diligence, avoid unnecessary interaction. But then Harwell stopped, near where Benjamin was working. He stood there for a moment, studying his journal, then looked up at the tobacco racks, overhead. The silence stretched between them, filled only with the small sounds of the barn, the creak of rope, the rustle of drying leaves, the distant call of a crow outside. The quality of the silence felt different than usual somehow. More pregnant with possibility, as if something unspoken was pressing to be articulated. "This crop's coming along well," Harwell said finally, his voice neither friendly nor hostile. It was a statement of fact, the kind of comment he might make about weather or equipment. But there was something in his tone that suggested he was speaking more to fill silence than to convey actual information. "Yes, sir," Benjamin replied quietly, keeping his eyes on the tobacco leaves in front of him. More silence, Benjamin sensed, rather than saw Harwell's continued presence beside him. The overseer seemed to be struggling with something, working up to saying whatever had brought him into the barn at this particular moment. Finally, he spoke again, and this time there was something different in his voice, something that sounded almost like weariness or uncertainty. "You ever think about how much work goes into all this?" Harwell gestured at the barn around them, at the thousands of tobacco leaves hanging in careful rows. "How many hands touching every single leaf, from planting to harvest to curing to sale? How many hours of labor in each bale that gets loaded onto a riverboat?" Benjamin didn't know how to respond. These kinds of reflective questions from an overseer were unusual, possibly dangerous. Harwell wasn't known for philosophical conversations with the people he supervised. Benjamin chose the safest option. "Yes, sir, I suppose there is." Harwell nodded almost to himself. He seemed about to continue his inspection and leave, but then he paused. He looked around the tobacco barn at the columns of light cutting through the dusty air, at the hanging leaves that represented months of intensive labor, at the massive beams that supported the entire structure. "All of this," Harwell said slowly, "it all gets recorded. Whoa. Every bale, every pound, every transaction. Mr. Graves keeps meticulous records, best agricultural journals in Halifax County. Probably you could go back 10 years and tell me exactly how many bales we produced in August of 1849. What price we got for them. What the weather was like that month." He paused, then added, "That's important in agriculture. Record-keeping documentation, being able to track productivity and costs and returns on investment." Benjamin listened without responding, uncertain where this conversation was going, or why Harwell seemed compelled to have it. The overseer was still looking around the barn, but his gaze seemed distant, as if he was seeing something beyond the physical space. "Complete records," Harwell continued. "That's what separates successful operations from failing ones. Documentation of everything significant that happens in that moment." Standing among the hanging tobacco, with columns of dusty light surrounding them, James Harwell did something he rarely did. He made direct eye contact with Benjamin. It was brief, just a few seconds. But in that brief connection, Benjamin saw something unexpected in the overseer's eyes. Not cruelty or hardness, but something more like exhaustion or confusion, as if Harwell himself wasn't entirely sure why he was having this conversation. "You've been here your whole life." Harwell said it wasn't a question, but Benjamin nodded confirmation anyway. "Your mother's Ruth, the cook. Your father died in that press accident back in '49. Yes, sir. You do your work. Don't cause trouble. Keep your head down." Again, these were statements, not questions. Benjamin felt his heart beating faster, uncertain where this conversation was leading, and why Harwell seemed to be cataloguing information he almost certainly already knew. Then James Harwell said something that would later seem significant, though at the time, Benjamin didn't fully understand why. "I've been thinking lately about accounts," the overseer said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "about things that get written down in ledgers and journals, about what gets recorded and what gets set aside." He held up his leather journal slightly, as if to illustrate his point. Every bale of tobacco that leaves this estate is recorded. Every purchase of equipment, every expense, every transaction, all written down, dated, signed. 20 years from now, someone could open these books and see exactly what happened here, could tell you precisely how profitable we were, what our costs were, how the operation functioned. Benjamin stood very still, unsure whether this required a response. Harwell looked at him with those deep-set eyes that had observed so much over the years. "But some things don't get recorded," Harwell continued. His voice had dropped to something quieter, almost contemplative, almost contemplative. "Some things happen, and they're just not in the official documentation, not in any ledger, no detailed entry, just a brief note maybe, or sometimes nothing at all, like they never occurred, like they weren't significant enough to deserve permanent record." The silence that followed felt heavy with unspoken meaning. Benjamin understood with a clarity that made his chest tighten that Harwell was talking about Marcus, about the punishment, about all the violence and suffering that happened at Riverside Estate that would never appear in any official accounting of the plantation's operations. Benjamin had spent his entire life learning to read situations, to understand what was being communicated beyond the actual words spoken. It was a survival skill, the ability to perceive what white people actually meant, regardless of what they explicitly said. And in this moment he recognized that James Harwell was doing something unusual. He was acknowledging, however indirectly, the gap between official records and actual reality. He was admitting, perhaps without fully realizing it, that there were two histories of Riverside Estate, and the one written in ledgers and agricultural journals, and the one that existed in memory and trauma, and all the things too terrible or troubling to document. And that's when Benjamin asked his question. Later people would debate the exact wording and whether Benjamin had planned to ask it, or if it emerged spontaneously. But those who were positioned near enough to hear, and there were at least 3 other people working in adjacent parts of the barn, all agreed on the essential content of what Benjamin said. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. He didn't sound angry or accusatory. If anything, there was a kind of curious sincerity in his tone, as if he were genuinely asking something he wanted to understand. He maintained the respectful posture expected of him, didn't make aggressive eye contact, didn't alter his body language in any way that could be interpreted as threatening or insubordinate. "Mr. Harwell," Benjamin said, his voice barely above a conversational level, "when you're reading those journals late at night and you see all those things that got recorded, the tobacco weights, the equipment costs, all those numbers and dates in neat columns, do you ever wonder about the things that aren't written down? Do you ever think about how all those missing entries might add up? And if someone did write them all down, every single thing that happened but never got recorded, every detail that got left out or summarized in a single line, would your name be on more pages than you could count? Would there be enough paper in all of Virginia to hold that complete accounting? For several heartbeats, James Harwell didn't respond. He stood there among the hanging tobacco leaves, his journal still in his hand, staring at Benjamin with an expression that was impossible to read. His mouth opened slightly as if he were about to say something, but no words came out. His face had gone pale, and his eyes had taken on a distant, unfocused quality, as if Benjamin's question had triggered some internal process that was pulling his attention away from the physical reality of the barn. Then, without saying another word, without acknowledging the question or responding to it in any way, James Harwell turned and walked out of the barn. His movements were mechanical, his gait slightly unsteady. Benjamin watched him go, the overseer's figure silhouetted briefly in the bright rectangle of the barn door before disappearing into the sunlight outside. The other workers in the barn had heard the exchange, though they'd been far enough away that they might have missed some of the specific words. But they'd all seen Harwell's reaction, the sudden pallor, the shocked expression, the wordless departure. One of them, a man named Joseph, who'd worked at Riverside Estate for 15 years, later said, "I've never seen Mr. Harwell look like that, like someone had reached inside him and pulled something loose, like he'd seen something terrible that nobody else could see." That was Friday morning, probably around 10:00, based on the position of the sun. By Friday afternoon, everyone at Riverside Estate noticed that James Harwell seemed different. He went about his duties, inspecting the fields, checking on work crews, making his usual rounds. But something had fundamentally changed in his demeanor. He was quieter than usual, more withdrawn. Several people tried to speak with him about routine matters and found him distracted, as if his mind were somewhere else entirely. Robert Finch, one of the other overseers, approached Harwell in the early afternoon with questions about equipment allocation for the following week. Finch was a practical man, focused on logistics and efficiency, and he needed Harwell's approval for purchasing replacement parts for one of the tobacco presses. He found Harwell standing near the edge of the tobacco fields, staring out at the rows of plants, but not seeming to actually see them. "Out for you, James," Finch called, walking up beside him. "I need your authorization on this requisition. Can you look at these figures?" Harwell turned slowly, as if waking from sleep. He looked at Finch with a kind of dazed confusion, as if temporarily uncertain who this person was or why they were talking to him. "The requisition," Finch repeated, holding out the paper with the equipment list and cost estimates. Harwell took the paper mechanically and stared at it. His eyes moved across the page, but it wasn't clear whether he was actually reading the words or just going through the motions. After a long moment, he handed it back to Finch without comment. "So, is that approved?" Finch asked, confused by the lack of response. Harwell seemed to refocus with effort. Yes, whatever you need. Just write it down. Make sure it's recorded properly." Finch found this response odd. Harwell was usually more engaged with procurement decisions, often questioning costs and comparing options, but he accepted the approval and started to walk away. Before he'd gone more than a few steps, Harwell spoke again. "Robert," he said, his voice strange and distant. "How many people have worked at this estate? In the years you've been here, how many different people?" Finch stopped and turned back, puzzled by the question. "I don't know, James. 40-some now, and there's always some turnover when people get sold or die. Why are you asking?" Harwell didn't answer directly. "Do you remember their names?" "All of them. Some," Finch said slowly. "The ones who've been here a long time or who caused problems or who were particularly good workers." "Why?" "I was trying to remember earlier," Harwell said, still in that distant tone, trying to recall the first person I ever punished here. It was my second week, I think. 7 years ago, someone had broken a tool or stolen something, or I can't remember what the infraction was. Can't remember the person's name either. Just that I wrote it down somewhere because Mr. Graves wanted records of all disciplinary actions. But I can't remember the name. Finch felt increasingly uncomfortable with the conversation. That's normal, isn't it? We can't remember every little incident from years ago. You deal with dozens of people every day. Can't expect to remember them all. No, Harwell agreed quietly. Can't remember them all, but they all happened. Every single one. They're real, even if they're not in my memory anymore. Even if the only record is a brief line in a journal somewhere. James, are you feeling all right? Finch asked, genuinely concerned now. You're talking strange. Maybe you should rest. Get out of this heat. Harwell seemed to shake himself as if trying to return to normal function. I'm fine, he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. Just tired. Go ahead with that requisition. I'll see you later, laughed, troubled by the interaction. He would later tell Sheriff Brennan that Harwell had seemed haunted during that conversation, as if something were eating at him from the inside. As Friday evening approached, Harwell's strange behavior intensified. He appeared at the main house, startling Albert Graves by requesting access to the estate's archived record books, not the current operational journals, but the historical ledgers, going back to when Harwell had first been hired in 1852. Graves found this request unusual, furry, but saw no reason to refuse it. You looking for something specific? He asked. Just want to review some past entries, Harwell said vaguely. Make sure my records align with the overall documentation. Graves led him to the estate office, a room in the main house where decades of plantation records were stored in locked cabinets and on sturdy shelves. He unlocked the cabinets and pulled out the relevant ledgers, stacking them on the large desk that dominated the room. These go back to 1850, Graves said. Your tenure is all in these 5 volumes. You planning to be here a while? However long it takes, Harwell answered, already opening the first ledger. Graves left him there, and Harwell spent the next several hours paging through the records. House servants who passed by the office later described seeing him sitting at the desk, surrounded by open ledgers, his expression increasingly troubled. One servant, a woman named Sarah, who brought him coffee without being asked, said his behavior was deeply strange. He was running his finger down the pages. Sarah recalled like he was counting something. He'd stop on certain entries and just stare at them for the longest time, not moving at all. His lips were moving like he was talking to himself, but I couldn't hear what he was saying. Then he'd close that book and open another one and start the same process over again. At one point, Sarah heard him say something aloud, just a fragment, but it stuck in her memory. That's 3. Just in September of 53. 3, and I can only remember one of them clearly. When Harwell finally left the office, it was nearly dark. Sarah, curious and concerned, looked at the desk after he'd gone. The ledgers were still scattered across its surface, open to various pages. She couldn't make sense of what he'd been looking for, but she noticed that many of the pages had brief entries marked disciplinary action, followed by dates and occasionally names. The entries were sparse, just a few words summarizing each incident, but there were many of them scattered throughout the 7 years of records. That evening, Harwell didn't return to his house for dinner. When Robert Finch went to check on him around 8, he found Harwell standing outside the slave quarters, just standing there in the darkness, watching the small fires that burned outside the cabins where people prepared their evening meals. The quarters were a collection of small wooden structures, simple cabins that housed the estate's enslaved workforce. Smoke from cooking fires rose into the night sky, carrying the smell of whatever meager food people had managed to prepare. Quiet conversations drifted through the darkness, along with occasional laughter, the small sounds of people trying to maintain humanity and connection despite everything designed to strip those things away. James Finch called to him, approaching with a lantern. "You planning to stand out here all night? You're making people nervous." Harwell turned to look at him, and Finch later swore that the overseer's eyes were glistening with something. Tears, perhaps, or just the reflection of the fires. His face was haggarded, as if he'd aged years in the span of a single day. "I was trying to count," Harwell said quietly, "trying to count how many people are here now, who were also here when I started, trying to figure out how many have left, sold or died or run off, trying to remember who they were." "Why?" Finch asked, growing more concerned. "Why does that matter?" "Because of pages," Harwell answered, his voice barely audible. "Because someone asked me about pages, about what would be on those pages if everything got written down. Every detail, every name, every specific thing that happened." Finch didn't understand. "What are you talking about? What pages?" But Harwell had already turned away, walking not toward his own house, but in the direction of the tobacco barn. Finch called after him, but Harwell didn't stop or respond. He just kept walking until the darkness swallowed his figure, and Finch could no longer see him. Finch considered following him, but decided against it. Harwell was clearly going through something, some kind of mental crisis or breakdown. But Finch didn't know how to help, or even whether help would be welcome. He returned to his own cabin, troubled by what he'd witnessed, but unsure what action, if any, he should take. Saturday morning arrived with the usual rhythms of plantation life. Work crews assembled at dawn. Assignments were distributed, and labor commenced in the tobacco fields and curing barn. But James Harwell didn't appear for the morning inspection. This was unprecedented. In 7 years, Harwell had never missed a morning inspection, never failed to be present when work began. Robert Finch went to Harwell's house and found it empty. The bed was made, suggesting Harwell hadn't slept there. A plate of food sat untouched on the table. Dinner from the previous evening, apparently brought over by someone, but never eaten. Finch felt a growing sense of alarm. He checked the tobacco barn, thinking Harwell might have spent the night there, but found only the usual workers beginning their morning tasks. Around mid-morning, one of the field hands reported seeing Harwell near the estate's small cemetery, a plot of land where enslaved people who died at Riverside Estate were buried. The graves were simple, most marked with nothing more than wooden crosses or rough stones. Few had names attached. Death records in the estate's ledgers often noted simply field and male, approximate age 30, without any further identification. Finch went to the cemetery and found Harwell there, walking slowly among the graves as Finch approached. He saw that Harwell was carrying his leather journal and appeared to be trying to match graves with entries in his records. "James," Finch said carefully, not wanting to startle him. "People are asking where you are. Work's begun, and you're needed." Harwell looked up, seeming disoriented. "Do you know who's buried here?" he asked. "Which grave is which? I've been trying to figure it out from the records, but most of the entries don't have names, just dates and approximate ages. B.A. December 1855, female, about 40. March 1857, male, mid-20s. How are you supposed to know who that actually was from just that information?" "I don't know, James, but why does it matter right now? You need to come back. Need to do your job. My job," Harwell repeated, his voice strange. "Yes, my job. That's all documented, isn't it? 7 years of doing my job. 7 years of entries in ledgers. 7 years of pages." There was that word again. Pages. Finch was beginning to understand that something specific had triggered this breakdown, something related to record-keeping and documentation. But he still couldn't grasp exactly what. "Come on," Finch said, trying for a firm, directive tone. "Whatever's bothering you, you can work through it later. Right now, people need supervision. The operation can't run without you." Harwell allowed himself to be led away from the cemetery back toward the main estate grounds, but his behavior throughout the rest of Saturday remained disturbed. He performed his duties mechanically, giving instructions and making decisions, but seeming disconnected from what he was doing. Multiple people approached Finch privately to express concern about the head overseer's mental state. By Saturday evening, Albert Graves had heard enough reports to become seriously concerned. He summoned Harwell to the main house and questioned him directly about what was wrong. "Nothing, sir," Harwell said, though his appearance contradicted the claim. He looked exhausted, his eyes shadowed, and his face drawn. "You've been acting strange for 2 days," Graves said bluntly. "Multiple people have reported it. You're distracted. You're neglecting duties. You're behaving in ways that are making everyone nervous. What's going on?" "Biso." Harwell hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "Sir, when you review the operational records, the ledgers and journals we keep, do you feel that they accurately represent everything that happens here?" Graves frowned, puzzled by the question. "They represent what needs to be represented: agricultural data, financial transactions, significant incidents. Why? What about the things that aren't included, are well pressed, the things that happen but only get brief mentions, or don't get recorded at all?" "Those things aren't relevant to the plantation's operations," Graves said, his tone suggesting he found this line of questioning odd and inappropriate. "We record what matters for running the business. We don't need exhaustive documentation of every minor incident." "But they happened," Harwell said quietly. "Even if they're not in the records, they happened, and someone remembers. Even if I've forgotten, someone remembers." Graves studied his head overseer with growing concern. "James, has someone said something to you? Made some accusation or threat?" "Just asked a question," Harwell answered. "Just asked me to think about what it would be like if everything got written down. Every detail, every specific thing, how many pages that would fill." Now Graves was genuinely alarmed. This sounded like the kind of thinking that preceded legal trouble or abolitionist agitation. "Who asked you this? Which of the slaves?" But Harwell wouldn't say. He simply repeated that someone had asked a question and that he couldn't stop thinking about the answer. Graves dismissed him with clear frustration, telling him to get himself together and return to proper functioning by Monday morning, or face consequences first. Harwell left the main house and wandered the grounds as darkness fell. Several people saw him that evening, always alone, always looking troubled. Ruth, Benjamin's mother, saw him standing outside her cabin around 9:00. She stepped outside, partly from curiosity and partly from concern. Harwell had never come to the quarters at night except during inspections or emergencies. "Mr. Harwell," she said carefully, "something you need." Harwell seemed startled, as if he hadn't realized he was standing directly outside someone's home. "Your son, Benjamin, he's been here his whole life." Ruth felt her chest tighten with fear. Why was the overseer asking about her son? "Yes, sir. Born here, and his father died. The press accident. I remember that. I was new here, still learning the equipment and the operation. Your husband, I'm sorry, I can't remember his name. He was helping repair the press and something failed in the mechanism. His name was Thomas," Ruth said quietly. "And yes, sir, that's what happened." "Thomas," Harwell repeated. "I should have remembered that. Should be able to remember the name of a man who died in an accident on my watch." He paused, then added, "I wonder if I wrote it down completely. I know there was an incident report for Mr. Graves, but I can't remember how detailed it was. Can't remember if I included his full name or just described him as field hand press accident. Ruth didn't know how to respond to this. She waited silently, watching the overseer's face in the dim light from her cabin. Your son asked me a question yesterday, Harwell said, finally, in the tobacco barn about records and memory about what would be written down if everything got written down. Ruth felt cold fear settle in her stomach. What had Benjamin done? Sir, if he was disrespectful, I apologize. He didn't mean any. No, Harwell interrupted. He wasn't disrespectful. He just asked a question, but I can't stop thinking about it. Can't stop trying to answer it. He stood there in the darkness for another moment, then walked away without saying anything else. Ruth immediately went to find Benjamin, terrified about what consequences might follow from whatever conversation he'd had with the overseer. She found him at a neighbor's cabin, helping repair a leaking roof using scraps of wood and tar. She pulled him aside and demanded to know what he'd said to Harwell. Benjamin explained the conversation in the tobacco barn, Harwell's comments about record-keeping, his own question about what a complete accounting would look like, the overseer's shocked reaction and wordless departure. Why would you say that to him? Ruth asked urgently. You know better than to talk to overseers about anything except what's directly asked of you. He was talking about Marcus, Benjamin said quietly. About how some things don't get recorded. About how the ledgers show tobacco yields but not the things that happen to people. He was almost admitting it. Ma almost acknowledging that there's a difference between what's written down and what's real. So, I just asked him to think about that difference, about what it would mean to actually see it all laid out. And now he's falling apart, Ruth said, walking around like a ghost, asking strange questions, looking like he's lost his mind. You know what they'll do if they think you caused this. If they decide you somehow attacked him or threatened him or used some kind of influence. Benjamin nodded soberly. I know, but Ma, all I did was ask a question. I didn't threaten him, didn't touch him, just asked him to think about something he was already thinking about. If that broke him, he trailed off, leaving the implication unspoken. If a simple question could break James Harwell, then Harwell was already damaged in ways that had nothing to do with Benjamin. Sunday morning dawned clear and warm, the kind of late summer day where the heat would build gradually through the morning and peak in the oppressive afternoon. For most people at Riverside Estate, Sunday meant a partial break from labor. Still work to be done, but less intensive than the 6 days prior. Some people used the time to tend small personal gardens, repair clothes, or simply rest. The worker who discovered James Harwell's body was a man named David. One of the more experienced hands who'd been assigned to prepare equipment in the tobacco barn for the week ahead. He arrived at the barn around 6 in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to burn off the night's coolness. What he saw when he opened the barn door would stay with him for the rest of his life. James Harwell was hanging from one of the main support beams, approximately 12 feet off the ground. His body swayed very slightly in the air current created by opening the door. His face was turned away, but there was no question who it was. The clothing, the build, the distinctive watch chain visible even from a distance. David stood frozen for several seconds, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Then he turned and ran, calling for help, his voice breaking the morning's quiet. Within minutes, people were converging on the barn from all directions. Robert Finch arrived first, took one look at the scene, and immediately ordered everyone to stay outside while he went to inform Albert Graves. By the time Sheriff Thomas Brennan arrived from town around mid-morning, the barn had filled with people despite Finch's orders, other overseers, house servants, and eventually Graves himself, all standing in shocked silence beneath Harwell's suspended body. The scene was deeply disturbing in its stillness. Harwell's body had stopped swaying, hanging motionless in the dusty light that filtered through the barn's walls. His boots were just inches from the ground, positioned as if he'd been reaching down for something, just out of reach. Brennan was a methodical man who'd served as sheriff for almost 15 years. He'd investigated numerous deaths, accidents, illnesses, occasional murders, and several previous suicides. He approached such matters with careful attention to detail and minimal emotional reaction, understanding that effectiveness in his role required objective assessment rather than sympathetic response. He examined the scene thoroughly before allowing anyone to cut Harwell down. The rope was secured to a beam approximately 12 feet off the ground, one of the main structural supports that ran the length of the barn. The rope appeared to be standard hemp, the kind used throughout the plantation for various purposes. It was tied with a particular kind of knot that Brennan recognized from his own experience with agricultural equipment and rigging. Below Harwell's body was a wooden crate pushed over on its side. The crate was substantial, the kind used for transporting tools or supplies, and appeared to have been positioned under the beam intentionally. The implication was clear. Harwell had stood on the crate, secured the rope around his neck, and kicked the crate away. The positioning of his feet, hanging just inches from the ground, suggested there had been no struggle, no attempt to reach back to the crate, or otherwise save himself once the process began. Beside the overturned crate, lying in the dirt and scattered tobacco leaves that covered the barn floor, was Harwell's leather journal. It lay open face down, pages bent beneath its weight. Brennan picked it up carefully and examined it. The journal was open to a page dated 3 days earlier. Friday, the day Benjamin had asked his question. Brennan read the entry silently first, his expression becoming increasingly troubled. Then he called Albert Graves over and showed him what was written there. The entry began normally enough, describing routine matters, tobacco yield estimates, notes about equipment maintenance, observations about weather conditions that might affect the curing process. Harwell's handwriting in this section was neat and controlled. The familiar script of someone making routine daily notes, but about halfway down the page, the handwriting changed dramatically. It became larger, less controlled, the letters more irregular, and pressed harder into the paper, as if Harwell had been bearing down with increasing force. What followed was unlike anything else in the journal, not practical notes about plantation operations, but something more like a confession or crisis of conscience. The entry said, "Question posed to me today about accountability and record keeping. Good. Cannot stop thinking about ledgers, about entries not made, about actions taken that exist only in memory or not even there. Spent evening attempting calculation. If each incident were one page, one full accounting with dates, names, specific circumstances, specific outcomes, how many volumes would be required? The number troubles me greatly. Have reviewed estate records for past 7 years. Official documentation shows crop yields, equipment purchases. Disciplinary actions summarized, never detailed, typically just date and brief note. Disciplinary action, field hand with sometimes a name, sometimes not. No record of sounds people made, no mention of specific injuries, no accounting of faces that I can no longer recall or names I never knew. The question was, would my name be on more pages than I could count? Attempted literal count tonight. Went through the ledgers, found 73 entries, marked disciplinary action, over 7 years. 73 brief notes, each summarizing something that if written in full detail would fill at least a page, probably more. That's 73 pages, just from what's mentioned. But what about what's not mentioned? Many. The warnings given, the threats made, the constant presence and enforcement that doesn't rise to the level of official entry. How many pages for those? Tried to count incidents, not recorded. Lost track after the entry ended there, mid-sentence, the final words trailing off the page as if Harwell had been unable or unwilling to complete the thought. The next pages in the journal were blank. Sheriff Brennan read the entry multiple times, his expression becoming increasingly grave. He questioned everyone present about Harwell's behavior over the preceding days, and that's how he learned about the deterioration that had been observed. The distraction, the wandering, the strange comments about pages and memory and record-keeping. Eventually, Brennan learned about Benjamin's question, though accounts varied regarding the exact wording. Some said Benjamin had asked about ledgers, others about journals, still others about pages and names and things that don't get written down. But all the accounts agreed on the essential message. Benjamin had asked Harwell to consider the full accounting of his actions, the complete record of everything he'd done as overseer. Brennan called Benjamin to the barn to question him directly. Benjamin came without resistance or apparent fear, though he must have known that being summoned by a white sheriff to answer questions about a white man's death was extraordinarily dangerous. You had a conversation with Mr. Harwell on Friday morning, Brennan said. It wasn't a question, but Benjamin nodded confirmation. In this barn? Yes, sir. Tell me what was said. Everything you can remember. Benjamin recounted the conversation. Harwell's presence in the barn, his comments about record-keeping and documentation, his observation that some things get recorded while others don't. Then Benjamin's question about whether Harwell ever thought about the missing entries, about what a complete accounting might look like, about whether Harwell's name would be on more pages than he could count. Brennan listened without interruption, watching Benjamin's face carefully. What did you mean by that question? He asked when Benjamin finished. What were you trying to accomplish? Benjamin chose his words carefully. Mr. Harwell was talking about things that happened, but don't get written down, about the difference between official records and actual events. I was just asking if he'd thought about what that difference might mean. How much might be missing from the books? You were asking him to confront everything he'd done that wasn't in official records, Brennan said bluntly. To imagine all of it, documented completely. Were you trying to make him feel guilty? Benjamin met the sheriff's eyes directly. I was asking a question, sir. Just a question. I didn't know how he'd answer it, or if it would affect him at all. I was just curious what he'd say. Brennan studied him for a long moment, trying to determine whether this was the truth or a careful evasion. Eventually, he turned to Albert Graves. This man asked a question, Brennan said. A pointed question, maybe one that made Harwell think about uncomfortable things. Oh, but asking a question isn't a crime, and Mr. Harwell clearly took his own life. The overturned crate, the positioned rope, the journal entry, all of it points to suicide. Nobody forced him to do this. He wasn't coerced or threatened. He destroyed himself. Graves wanted Benjamin punished regardless, arguing that causing an overseer to commit suicide was tantamount to murder, but Brennan was firm. You can't hang a man for asking a question, he said bluntly, especially when the man he asked went and hanged himself 3 days later. If your overseer was so psychologically fragile that a simple question broke him, that's not the slave's fault. The argument continued for some time, but Brennan held his position. From a legal standpoint, there was no case against Benjamin. No crime had been committed beyond the suicide itself, and you couldn't prosecute someone for self-murder. Eventually, Graves relented, though he remained deeply unsettled by the entire situation. James Harwell's body was cut down and taken to the estate house for preparation for burial. Oh, the official cause of death was recorded as suicide by hanging with a note that the deceased had shown signs of mental disturbance in the days preceding his death. The circumstances that triggered that disturbance were mentioned only briefly in Brennan's report. Overseer had become preoccupied with questions of record-keeping and historical accountability. Mental deterioration observed by multiple witnesses over a 3-day period prior to death. But the unofficial record, the story that began spreading through Halifax County almost immediately, was far more detailed and far more disturbing. The tale of James Harwell and the question that broke him proved irresistibly compelling, touching something deep in the psychology of people throughout the region. What do you think of this story so far? Are you wondering what really drove James Harwell to his breaking point? If this tale of accountability and hidden records is keeping you engaged, show your support by hitting that like button and leave a comment with your theory. Do you think Harwell's guilt was enough to kill him? Or was there something else at play? Don't forget to share this with someone who appreciates dark historical mysteries. Now, let's explore what happened after they cut him down and the even darker details that came to light. In the days following Harwell's death, Sheriff Brennan continued his investigation, less because he believed there was a crime to solve, and more because he felt compelled to understand exactly what had happened. The psychological destruction of a man in response to a single question troubled him deeply, suggesting dynamics he didn't fully understand, but recognized as significant. The first additional detail came from Robert Finch, who mentioned to Brennan that he'd heard voices coming from the tobacco barn late Saturday night, the night before Harwell's body was discovered. Finch had been lying in his cabin, unable to sleep due to the oppressive heat, when he heard what sounded like conversation drifting from the direction of the barn. "I thought maybe someone was stealing tobacco," Finch explained, "or maybe conducting some kind of secret meeting. So I went to investigate. Must have been around midnight. But when I got close to the barn, the voices stopped. I went inside with a lantern, checked all through the building. Nobody there, not a soul." Brennan asked if Finch had seen James Harwell during this nighttime excursion. Finch said no, but he'd noticed a light in the office building where the estate records were kept. Figured it was Mr. Harwell still paging through those ledgers like he'd been doing. Didn't want to disturb him. He'd been acting so strange. I thought maybe he needed space to work through whatever was troubling him. So I went back to bed. This meant Harwell had been alive and active as late as midnight Saturday. At some point between then and 6:00 a.m. Sunday, when David discovered the body, Harwell had gone to the tobacco barn and hanged himself. The narrow window of time suggested a decision made in the dark, early morning hours. A moment when whatever internal struggle he'd been experiencing reached its conclusion. The second detail came from Ruth, Benjamin's mother. She approached Sheriff Brennan privately, clearly nervous about speaking, but feeling compelled to do so. She told him about Harwell's visit to the quarters on Saturday night, his strange questions about Benjamin and about Ruth's late husband, Thomas, his comments about trying to remember names, and whether he'd recorded things completely. He seemed like a man who was haunted. Ruth said quietly, like he was seeing things nobody else could see, like the past had come alive for him somehow, and he couldn't escape it. Brennan asked if Harwell had said anything threatening or made any accusations. Ruth shook her head. "No, sir. He just asked questions." Seemed like he was trying to piece together memories, or maybe trying to understand something about himself. It was sad more than frightening, like watching someone fall apart. The third detail, and the most disturbing, came from examining Harwell's personal effects in his small house. Sheriff Brennan conducted this search with Albert Graves present, inventorying Harwell's possessions for legal purposes, but also looking for anything that might explain his mental state. The house was as spare and organized as Harwell had kept it in life. Clothes neatly folded in the chest, books arranged on shelves, personal items minimal and carefully maintained. But on the table in the main room, Brennan found something extraordinary. A stack of papers, perhaps 20 sheets covered with Harwell's handwriting. The pages weren't dated or organized in any clear fashion, and many were incomplete entries that started and then stopped mid-sentence, as if Harwell had been unable to continue. They appeared to be attempts at the kind of full accounting his journal entry had referenced, detailed documentation of specific incidents from his 7 years as overseer. Brennan gathered the pages carefully and read through them slowly, his expression growing darker with each sheet. The pages represented Harwell's attempt to do what Benjamin's question had implied, to write down in complete detail everything he'd done that wasn't adequately reflected. In the official plantation records, some pages had only a single line. November 1852. Couldn't have been more than 16 years old. I think her name was Sarah, but I'm not certain. Don't remember what the infraction was. Mother watched from the cabin door. Another page contained several disconnected fragments. The sound when Leather meets his mother watched, and I pretended not to notice her face because never recorded the names of the ones who. In winter, the recovery takes longer because a third page was more complete, though it still ended abruptly. August 1854. Man named Peter accused of stealing food from smokehouse. Later, learned his wife had just given birth and couldn't work. Family was hungry. Should have asked about circumstances first. 3 days recovery time. Could still see the marks 2 weeks later when he was working in the near field. And several pages dealt with Marcus. The most recent incident. Marcus, age approximately 20, punished for carved bird figure that someone reported as possible signal for escape. He said it was just a bird, that he liked watching birds, that he'd carved it himself during free time. I believed him, but Mr. Graves wanted vigilance demonstrated, wanted examples made. So the entry about Marcus went on longer than most others, covering nearly 2 full pages with details that made Brennan deeply uncomfortable to read. It described Marcus' face during the punishment, the sounds he made, the way he'd collapsed when it was over, the 2 men who'd carried him back to his cabin. It described Ruth and other women tending to him afterward, applying what limited care they could provide. It described Marcus's mother crying and how Harwell had walked away without acknowledging her. Brennan counted the pages and found that Harwell had filled or partially filled 13 sheets. 7 remained blank, though creases and small marks suggested Harwell had held them, perhaps intending to write, but unable to begin. The pages represented something Brennan had never encountered before. A perpetrator attempting to fully account for his own actions, trying to create the complete record that official documentation deliberately avoided. The fragmentary nature of many entries suggested that even attempting this accounting had been psychologically devastating. Harwell could write a sentence or two about some incidents, but when he tried to capture full detail, when he tried to actually describe what he'd done and what the consequences had been, he couldn't continue. These need to be destroyed, Albert Graves said immediately, after reading several pages. His face was pale and his hands shook slightly holding the papers. If anyone sees this, if it somehow becomes public, these are evidence in a death investigation. Brennan interrupted firmly. They stay in official custody until the case is closed. After that, we can discuss disposition. Case, Graves protested. There is no case. The man killed himself. You said so yourself. What more is there to investigate? The question of why, Brennan answered. I don't believe a single question breaks a man's mind unless that mind was already fractured. These pages show that James Harwell was attempting something extraordinary and probably, improbably impossible. He was trying to honestly confront everything he'd done over 7 years, and the attempt destroyed him. Brennan took the pages with him when he left Riverside Estate, storing them with other case materials in his office, but he found himself returning to them repeatedly over the following days, reading and rereading Harwell's fragmentary confessions, third, trying to understand the psychology that had driven a man to attempt such accounting. And then, when the weight became unbearable to end his life, one entry in particular stayed with Brennan. It was on the 11th page, written in handwriting so shaky and irregular it was almost illegible. I thought I was just doing a job, managing a workforce, maintaining productivity, enforcing necessary discipline. I thought the ledgers told the story. So many bales of tobacco, so much profit, such efficient operations. I thought that's what I was. An agricultural manager, a business specialist. But Benjamin asked me about pages, about what would be on those pages if everything was written down. And now I can't stop seeing those pages. Can't stop trying to count them. 73 official disciplinary actions. But how many warnings? How many threats? How many times someone flinched when I walked past or worked faster because they were afraid or suffered in ways that never required official punishment because the system itself was punishment enough? How many pages for all of that? How many volumes to hold the complete truth of 7 years? I think the answer is more than I can count, more than I can face, more than I can survive reading. The entry continued for several more lines, but the handwriting became so erratic that Brennan couldn't decipher it. The final legible sentence was, I always knew, I think, but knowing and seeing are different things. I can't unsee it now. James Harwell was buried in a small cemetery near the edge of Riverside Estate, his grave marked with a simple stone bearing his name and years of life. No mention was made of his profession or position. Albert Graves attended the brief service, as did Robert Finch and several other white people associated with the estate. No enslaved people were present. Their attendance wasn't permitted, and besides, most would have felt nothing but relief that Harwell was gone. But in the quarters that evening, people spoke about what had happened. The story had spread throughout the enslaved community, naturally acquiring various interpretations and meanings. Some people saw it as divine justice, God's judgment on a man who'd caused so much suffering. Others viewed it more pragmatically. Harwell had simply looked too closely at what he'd been and couldn't live with what he saw. A few people wondered if there hadn't been something more to it, some kind of curse or influence that Benjamin had wielded through his question. Benjamin himself maintained a carefully neutral position. He acknowledged asking the question, admitted that he'd known it might trouble Harwell, but insisted he'd neither intended nor anticipated the overseer's complete breakdown and suicide. His mother wasn't entirely convinced. One evening, about a week after Harwell's death, she sat with Benjamin outside their cabin and asked him directly, "Did you know what would happen?" When you asked him that question, did you know it would destroy him? Benjamin was quiet for a long time, watching the last light fade from the sky. Finally, he answered carefully, "I didn't know it would kill him, but I knew something would happen. I understood that men like Mr. Harwell need to not think too carefully about certain things. They need to keep their minds on the practical matters, the tobacco weights and equipment costs, and things that go in ledgers. If they think too much about what doesn't go in the ledgers, about all the blank spaces in the official record, that can break them. You weaponized a question, Ruth said quietly. Made it do what you could never do directly. Benjamin didn't confirm or deny this interpretation. He simply said, "All I did was ask him to look at something honestly, to imagine what a complete accounting would actually look like. If that destroyed him, it's because he couldn't survive honesty about his own life." Ruth looked at her son with a mixture of pride and fear. Pride that he'd found a way to resist, however, indirectly. Fear of what could happen if anyone understood that his question hadn't been innocent curiosity, but rather a precisely aimed weapon that had found its mark with devastating accuracy. The new overseer they hired, Mr. Crawford, he watches you differently. She warned, like he knows you're dangerous somehow, even if he can't prove anything. Benjamin nodded acknowledgement. He would be careful, would continue keeping his head down, would maintain the appearance of being exactly what the system expected him to be. But he would also remember that sometimes the most powerful action available to someone without power is simply asking the right question at the right moment. The autumn of 1859 passed into winter, and life at Riverside Estate continued with its usual rhythms. The new head overseer, William Crawford, approached his duties with carefully calculated emotional distance, never spending more time in conversation with the enslaved workforce than his position absolutely required. He'd heard the story of what happened to James Harwell, and while he didn't entirely believe that a simple question could destroy a man, he nonetheless decided that minimizing unnecessary interaction was the safest course. The story of Harwell and the question that broke him spread far beyond Halifax County. Travelers and traders carried it throughout Virginia and into neighboring states, and the tale took on different forms depending on who told it and what they wanted it to mean. Abolitionists used it as an example of the psychological corruption inherent in slavery. How even those who enforced the system were damaged by it, how confronting the full reality of what slavery actually meant could destroy a person. Defenders of slavery dismissed it as propaganda, or alternatively argued that Harwell had been mentally weak, unsuited for the difficult but necessary work of plantation management. In December 1859, John Brown was executed for his raid on Harper's Ferry, and the entire South tensed with anticipation of coming conflict. The debates that had simmered for decades reached boiling point, and people throughout Virginia, including those at Riverside Estate, understood that war was increasingly inevitable. Sheriff Thomas Brennan kept Harwell's pages sealed in an envelope in his office, uncertain what to do with them. He reread them occasionally, always finding himself deeply troubled by the fragmentary nature of the attempted accounting, the incomplete sentences, the memories Harwell couldn't quite grasp, the descriptions that stopped just as they reached critical details. All of it suggested a man confronting something within himself that he couldn't fully face or articulate. In early 1860, Brennan made an unusual decision. He wrote a detailed report about the Harwell case, not for any official purpose, but rather for his own records. In this report, he included his observations and interpretations. The death of James Harwell presents questions that extend beyond simple determination of cause. While the physical cause was clearly self-inflicted hanging, the psychological mechanism that led to this action warrants examination. Harwell spent 7 years performing duties that required regular infliction of suffering on other human beings. To function in this role, he developed psychological defenses, primarily a focus on practical matters and official documentation while avoiding detailed consideration of the human consequences of his actions. A question posed by an enslaved man named Benjamin disrupted these defenses. The question asked Harwell to imagine a complete accounting of his actions. Not the brief entries in official ledgers, but full documentation of every incident, every consequence, every detail. This imagination exercise appears to have triggered a cascade of psychological responses that Harwell could not withstand. The pages found in Harwell's house show that he attempted to actually create this complete accounting. The attempt failed. He could not sustain the psychological burden of honestly documenting what he'd done. The fragmentary nature of his writing suggests that each time he tried to capture full detail, the weight of what he was acknowledging became unbearable. What interests me most is that Benjamin did not threaten Harwell, did not attack him, did not even accuse him of wrongdoing. He simply asked a question that made Harwell see himself clearly, and that clarity killed him. This suggests something profound about the systems of slavery and enforcement. They function only when those who operate them maintain psychological distance from the reality of what they do. When that distance collapses, when someone is forced to see the complete truth of their own actions, the result can be psychological destruction. Benjamin's question was, would your name be on more pages than you could count? The answer clearly was yes. And when Harwell tried to actually count those pages, tried to imagine what they would contain, he couldn't survive the enumeration. Brennan sealed this report along with Harwell's pages and stored them in his office. Years later, when the courthouse fire destroyed many records, both the pages and Brennan's report were lost. Only fragments of the story survived through oral tradition, and the memories of those who'd heard about the incident firsthand. For Benjamin, life at Riverside Estate continued through the increasingly tense months of 1860 and into 1861, when Virginia seceded from the Union in April 1861, and the war everyone had anticipated finally began. The plantation experienced the disruptions affecting all Southern agriculture. Men left to fight, productivity declined, and the system that had seemed so permanent began to visibly crack. Benjamin left Riverside Estate in late 1863, walking away with a group of other formerly enslaved people when Union forces came close enough to make escape feasible. He carried with him the clothes on his back, a small bag of personal items, and the memory of a question asked in a tobacco barn that had somehow killed a man without violence, without threat, simply through the power of forced honesty. Historical records of Benjamin's subsequent life are sparse and contradictory. Some accounts place him in Philadelphia, working as a laborer and later learning a trade. Other stories claim he joined the Union Army, though no military records conclusively confirm this. But what seems certain is that he survived the war and its aftermath, living at least into the 1890s, based on a single census record that may or may not refer to the same person. Riverside Estate itself declined rapidly after the war. Albert Graves struggled to adapt to the new economic realities of paid labor and reduced profitability. He sold portions of the land, watched the tobacco operation shrink year by year, and eventually died in 1879, having witnessed the complete transformation of the world he'd known. The main house deteriorated. The tobacco barn collapsed in a storm in the 1880s, and by the early 20th century, little remained except overgrown fields and foundation stones. But the story survived. It was told and retold, adapted and embellished, interpreted according to whatever meaning people wanted to extract from it. Some versions emphasized the supernatural, suggesting that Benjamin's question had carried some kind of curse or spiritual power. Others focused on the psychological dynamics, using Harwell's breakdown as a case study in guilt and conscience. Still others saw it as allegory about the necessity of confronting historical truth rather than maintaining comfortable fictions. What remained constant across all versions was the essential narrative, an overseer forced to confront the complete accounting of his actions, a question that made him see clearly what he'd been avoiding and the destruction that followed. That clarity. In 1924, a graduate student at the University of Virginia researching Virginia plantation history came across a brief mention of the Harwell case in old newspaper archives. Intrigued, he tracked down descendants of people who'd lived at Riverside Estate and conducted interviews trying to reconstruct what had actually happened. His resulting thesis included a chapter on the incident, describing it as a remarkable case of psychological collapse triggered by forced moral reckoning. The student interviewed an elderly woman who claimed to be the granddaughter of Ruth, Benjamin's mother. The woman shared stories passed down through her family, including details about Benjamin's question and its aftermath. According to this account, Benjamin had spent weeks thinking about how to resist the system that held him captive, understanding that direct resistance would be suicidal, but that there might be other forms of action available to someone who could think strategically. My grandmother told me that Benjamin understood something important. The woman said in the interview, he understood that the men who ran that system had to lie to themselves constantly, had to tell themselves stories about what they were doing, had to avoid looking too closely at reality. And he understood that if you could force them to really look honestly, some of them wouldn't survive it. So he waited for his opportunity. And when James Harwell started talking about records and things not being written down, Benjamin saw his chance. And Amimin saw his chance. He asked the one question that Harwell couldn't escape, the question that made him see himself clearly, and that seeing killed him as surely as a bullet would have. The thesis was filed in the university library, where it remained largely unread for decades. In the 1960s, during renewed interest in slavery history and African American resistance, the thesis was rediscovered and excerpts were published in an academic journal. This brought the Harwell story to a new audience. Scholars interested in forms of resistance that went beyond physical rebellion or escape. These scholars noted that Benjamin's action represented something sophisticated, psychological warfare conducted by someone with no weapons except intelligence and the ability to ask pointed questions. They compared it to other documented cases of enslaved people using words, ideas, and subtle psychological pressure to undermine or damage those who held power over them. But academic interest is one thing, popular memory is another. Among descendants of enslaved people throughout Virginia and the South, the story of James Harwell and Benjamin's question became something like a legend. A tale told to illustrate that power comes in many forms, and that sometimes the most effective weapon is simple truth. In Halifax County, where Riverside Estate once stood, occasional visitors still come looking for remnants of the plantation. Most find nothing. The land has been subdivided, sold, developed. The tobacco fields are gone, replaced by houses and roads and the infrastructure of modern life. No marker indicates where the estate once operated or where James Harwell hanged himself in a tobacco barn on a Sunday morning in September 1859. But the question endures. It's been asked countless times since Benjamin first posed it in that tobacco barn. Would your name be on more pages than you could count? The question that forces accounting, that demands honest confrontation with the full reality of one's actions rather than the sanitized version preserved in official records. It's a question that recognizes the gap between what gets documented and what actually happens, between the stories we tell ourselves and the truth we try to avoid. James Harwell couldn't survive answering that question honestly. He tried. His fragmentary pages prove he tried. But the weight of complete accounting was more than his psychological architecture could support. When he saw clearly what those pages would contain, when he understood that the count extended beyond any number he could face, he chose the rope over, continuing to live with that knowledge. This story of James Harwell shows us something profound about human psychology, about moral complicity, about the mechanisms we develop to avoid seeing ourselves clearly, and what happens when those mechanisms fail. It shows us that sometimes the most frightening thing isn't external threat, but internal truth. Not what others might do to us, but what we must face about ourselves. What do you think of this story? Could one question really destroy a man? Or was Harwell already broken before Benjamin spoke? Do you believe we've learned everything? Or are there still secrets buried where Riverside Estate once stood? What would happen if you tried to create a complete accounting of your own actions? Would you survive reading what you'd written? Leave your comment below with your interpretation. If you found this tale of psychological horror grounded in historical reality compelling, subscribe to Circle of Fear 1 and hit that notification bell so you never miss our explorations of America's darkest corners. Share this with someone who appreciates mysteries where the real terror comes from human nature itself and the truth we try so hard to avoid. Until next time, remember that the most frightening monsters aren't the ones in shadows. They're the ones we see when we finally look clearly in the mirror and the pages we'd rather leave.